As I mentioned, my name is Aveline de Ceresbroch. I am the Middle Kingdom's Lieutenant General for the Arts and Sciences. We are really thrilled to have a bunch of amazing entries on both sides, including all of our allies. I'm really quite excited to see all of them. And so tonight we're going to be going over 3 of the 4 rubrics for the competition itself. The majority of the entries are in the made objects category. So we're going to go over that first. So that way, for those of you who know that you are a made object entrant, you can go ahead and just log off afterwards, and I can preserve as much of your time as possible. And then we'll go over food and beverage, and then research, which are the other 2 that we have 2 entries in each of those other 2 categories, 2 entries each.
I'm Wynflaed, or Winnie. I am the Deputy ANS General for the East Kingdom.
Winnie is amazing, and it has really truly been a pleasure to work with both Esker and Winnie. So I'm really excited to meet them in person and have a drink with them at the end of things, and talk about how amazing all of the artisans are. So thank you very, very much. So no problem. Let me share my screen again. So first of all, I just want to go over some really basic general overarching notes for our judges. The first thing is that all judges will be asked to check in between 9 and 9:30 a.m. on the day of the competition, which is Thursday of War Week. And the competition is being held in the Great Hall. There will be a judges and entrants meeting at 9:30, from 9:30 to 9:50, about 15 to 20 minutes. And then that gives us about 10 minutes for everybody to sort of disperse to their areas, with judging beginning promptly at 10 a.m. We want to make a note that this year we're very intentional about trying to use the words supporting evidence as opposed to documentation, but I'm sure we'll all slip back into that very common phrase. However, we want to make sure that all of the judges and entrants are aware that supporting evidence is both written documentation as well as any information that is cited in the oral presentation. So just because it's not in writing does not mean it's not considered supporting evidence. We do not want all of you to have to read master's level theses that are 40 to 100 or more pages on your vacation. So, and it's nearly impossible to try to cover all of that in a 1-hour time slot as well. So we are encouraging our entrants, especially since there is such a brief period of time between when the rules were announced and when Pennsic is, we are really trying to make sure they don't feel overwhelmed that they have to basically create a thesis or a research paper on top of their entry. Okay, so if you can ask them the question and they can give you that answer, that is also considered supporting evidence. That doesn't mean that you can't ask them where they got that information from, and they should be able to cite where that information came from. But we just want to make that very clear to everybody, because I know that it does differ across many different kingdoms. A top score in each of these categories that we are going to go over does not mean it is a perfect entry. They should be very hard to get, but not impossible to achieve, okay? So a perfect score does not mean it's a perfect entry. It just means that that entry did, in fact, meet all of the aspects of the rubric, okay? Now, scoring should start at the top end. So where you see this row or this column of 6 right here, you should start here to see whether or not the entry you feel meets all of those various criteria within the rubric. And then if it doesn't, move backwards. We don't want you starting at the bottom and moving up. Okay, and that's something that East has definitely agreed to as well. An entrant may procure period materials from another source without penalty. This was done in period. So they do not have to grow their own flax to then spin it, to then weave it, to then have textile in order to make a garment. Okay, it's okay for them to outsource where those materials come from. Furthermore, entrants should not be penalized for making appropriate and justifiable substitutions in the following cases. So first, if something is simply not available in modern times, you cannot penalize them in their scoring. If something is demonstrated to be hazardous methods or materials, you cannot penalize them. If something is cost prohibitive, either the methods or the materials, you also cannot penalize them. And we ask that you take an entrant at their word if this is cost prohibitive to them, because cost prohibitive does in fact mean something different to everybody. And we want to make sure that this is an inclusive competition. Additionally, if there are any objections that are based on personal values or religious considerations, and a substitution is therefore made or even an omission, they cannot be penalized. And finally, food safety best practices is definitely something we want the entrants to be able to follow. So if they tell you this was for food safety, they cannot be penalized, even if it means it was not a period, method, or perhaps ingredients. That is not an exclusive list of acceptable justifications or substitutions, but there are ones that we wanted to make sure to mention to keep them top of mind. That should automatically, there should be no questions asked. If the entrant says this is the case, then you need to take them at face value, take them at their word, and not penalize them in that respective consideration for whichever score. The next point we want to make is about the difference between scope and skill or execution. Scope is you are supposed to be evaluating them on the difficulty and the challenge of an entry's creation and the sophistication and ambition of the goals or the research involved in a project. Do not automatically assume that because you have an earlier period entry that it's necessarily less complex, or that a single ingredient consumable is necessarily less complex than something that has multiple ingredients. You need to sort of take the package as a whole to evaluate that scope. So it's not only sort of the number of steps, the number of things involved, but also the complexity of the skill or the execution itself. Now, skill and execution is the workmanship or artistic ability that is used in producing the entry. And so you will see these two things talked about in different categories, and we often get confusion there. So we wanted to make sure to have a little bit of clarity just right off the cuff. Additionally, use of templates such as a pattern, not a kit, but a template is permitted, and the entrant should not be penalized if original exhaustive thought and interpretation were applied in their use. So if they say, I took a look at this pattern, I used this pattern, I evaluated to make sure that I felt that it was accurate for the time period and for the craftsman that would probably have used it, something similar to that, or cut these similar shapes, they cannot be penalized. Additionally, every score on your score sheet has to have comments. If you give them anything less than a 6, we need to be able to see you telling the entrant how they could have scored a 6 with you. And when you turn in your score sheets, we will have readers that will be on hand who will quickly go through your comments on your score sheets to make sure that you do have, in fact, some kind of justification or explanation for how an entrant may have gotten a 6 as opposed to a 5 or a 4. Furthermore, constructive criticism has to be actionable. If there's nothing that the entrant can do about it, do not bother commenting on it, okay? Lastly, we are on a very tight schedule at Pennsic, as you may have seen from the schedule, and therefore we highly, highly, highly recommend what we call the 20-20-20 system in the mid-realm. And that is, you give the entrant 20 minutes for them to be able to do some sort of presentation, present their work, or give an overview as they would like to sort of present the object or the entry to you. Then you give 20 minutes for the judges to ask questions or for conversation or maybe even good-natured debate to ensue about various things relevant to the entry. And finally, the last 20 minutes needs to be used for you to write up your scores and your comments. And I understand you're going to want to engage in lots of really amazing conversation. And that is one of the beauties of this competition, is that we are going to connect people about things they're super, super excited about. But please understand, our time schedule is extremely tight, and we must have your score sheets within 15 minutes of the last round that you were in ending, because then we're entering into the next round. And this is especially important for that last round of judging, because we are hoping that the judging ends at 3:30, and we have royals who will be showing up at about 3:30 so that we can do announcements. So please save your conversations for later. Most of the people will be around all day, and get those judging scores written down and the comments there as well. When you're turning in your last score sheet for the day, we will ask you to stand by. So as I mentioned, the readers can basically verify that we have everything that we need from you, that all of your scores make sense. You're not going to have to do any kind of math. You may be asked to stand by for as much as 10 or 15 minutes, especially if it's sort of a massive influx of sheets. But if you do this, it then permits us to say, okay, you're clear, you can either go and have some amazing conversations in the arts and sciences area, or if you have other things to do, you can then vacate the arts and sciences competition area, and we don't have to worry about trying to track you down somewhere at Pennsic, right? We welcome you to stay. We hope you will stay. We hope you will have amazing conversations and connections during this time. And we especially recommend that you come back if you must leave by 3:30, as I mentioned, because we will be making announcements of the victors in each category. And then we will be breaking down at 4 o'clock. So of course your help is appreciated if you have the time and the back strength to help them break down their things, break down tables, break down chairs, and maybe even help some of the entrants with getting their entries into order. So I promise we will go down the rubric and we will go by each of the categories that we feel like there needs to be conversation. And part of this is just going to be us sort of explaining to you, because rubrics are inherently flawed as humans are inherently flawed. There's never going to be a perfect rubric, because what is a sound justification to me may not be a sound justification to you. But hopefully tonight will give you a little more clarity about what we, as those that created the rubrics, intended. And then if you have any questions during the judging itself, by all means, you can call either one of us over or come to the judging area and we can give you some clarity. So now to the made objects rubric. Each of the rubrics will have 5 different categories or things that we are going to ask you to evaluate. And each of those 5 categories are going to have up to 6 points that you can allot to an entrant. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, we want you to start from the top end and work your way down. But for the purposes of this sort of talking about how to compare things, I'm actually going to work from the left side to the right to sort of explain what we mean by some of these things. So under the methods, you can see basically we're asking 2 things for you to consider in the criteria. And one is whether or not they have made a mostly modern or partly historical project. And then also, if there are any variations in the methods used from period methods, did they have some adequate justification, some sound justification, or was it weak justification? So when we talk about weak versus adequate versus sound justification, here is what we were envisioning, okay? Weak justification essentially relies primarily on assumptions without evidence or just pictorial evidence, citing only from tertiary sources or sources about objects from a different time period or geographic location that kind of doesn't really apply, with no effort to explain why it is an appropriate extrapolation. Adequate justification uses multiple secondary and maybe even some primary sources, if available, or cite sources from a different time period or geographic location, but then they do explain somewhat why those comparisons are appropriate between the object and these comparisons. They're doing some simple sort of synthesis of the data or the information from different sources into what you would probably say is a debatable argument, but at least they've made an argument, right? Whereas sound justification for an object or method variations is any variation from the historical evidence, if available. They use multiple secondary and primary sources. They're citing from sources about the objects from a different time period, but they have excellent sort of reasons why this extrapolation is appropriate. The synthesis of information and data from different sources is a very compelling and cohesive argument through analysis and experimentation. Okay, so that's sort of what we mean, the difference between weak, adequate, and sound justifications for variations in the methods used. Now, we also reference sort of the levels of evidence. We talk about some evidence, most evidence, and all evidence. Before anybody gets uptight about this, obviously we do not expect somebody to literally have every single piece of evidence when we say all evidence. It's more like all of the evidence that you would expect somebody to have. So like the main sources, the canon sources, if there's a new piece of research that came out that people in this field really should know about, but they're not referencing, that's what we're talking about when we say all of the known evidence. It's really more like the ones you would sort of expect to be there in a conversation. Whereas most of the evidence is sort of like most of the secondary, a couple maybe of the primary ones, whereas only some evidence is 2 or 3 pieces of evidence, and the sort of quality of that evidence is perhaps a little bit questionable. Now let's talk about scope and workmanship. And this is probably where we're going to have the most questions and some of the most vigorous debate, and that's okay. We wanted to really talk about what we were envisioning when we used words like entry-level scope versus a sophisticated scope, okay? So for a made object, it is, we kind of broke it out down into 5 things: the elements, the steps, the technique, the finish, and the appearance of the object itself. So an entry-level object is basically a single element object that has 3 or less steps to complete or to make or construct. It has simple technique with no real mastery of the technique itself, obvious construction flaws, etc. The finish is either unfinished or very poorly finished, and the appearance either is rushed and superficial and or completely modern. Okay, that's an entry-level scope object. Elementary, again, single element, less than 3 or so steps. There may be some more mastery of the technique than you're seeing in entry level, but the finish is finished and neat with maybe some visible construction flaws, or not as finished or detailed as the original was that they're using to compare or attempting to reproduce. And the appearance is clearly still modern, but pleasing, okay? Intermediate scope are things that have multiple elements as well as more than 3 steps needed to complete the object. The technique is more advanced and detailed with a mastery of some of the techniques that are shown within the object itself. The finish is finished and neat with few, if any, visible construction flaws, although it's still maybe not as detailed or as pleasing in finish as the original. And it's mostly historical and pleasing, but you can still see some modern construction and details. Once we get into sort of the advanced, complex, and sophisticated, this is where we're looking at multiple elements, definitely more than 3 steps needed to complete the entry. For an advanced one, the technique is maybe advanced and detailed with a mastery of techniques, whereas the complex would be finished and neat with most details and finished like the original or like you would expect one of that time would be, and may include some construction flaws that are found in originals, whereas sophisticated would be sophisticated techniques that are complex and detailed with impressive mastery of the techniques that are attempted within this. Okay. Now remember, scope and skill are 2 different things, but what they were going for is what we're asking you to judge here. In terms of the advanced finish and appearance, we're looking for finished and neat with some details like the original. It's pleasing and mostly historical with a mix of modern and historical construction and details. A complex scope would be something that is finished and neat with most details and finished like the original, but it's pleasing and historical. And the sophisticated is impressive and detailed with details and finish just like the original, or what you would imagine an original would look like, including any construction flaws that were frequently found in originals. It is pleasing. It is a reproduction quality-like appearance with exclusively historical construction and details. Now we're going to move on to the research and supporting evidence, and Winnie says she has finally gotten a little food in her and she is ready to take over. So I'm going to go ahead and expand this rubric right here so that hopefully it's a little bit easier for everybody to see, and we'll scroll down to that last category for her to be able to talk about.
Perfect. All right, thanks. Yes, husband rescued me a little. He is good. All right, so research and supporting evidence. So there are 3 types of sources to think about. So there's primary sources, which provide raw information and firsthand evidence of things. Examples include museum photographs of extant objects, examination of the original object, manuscript sources, and contemporary descriptions or works of art that depict the object, and statistical data from analysis of original objects by researchers in the field. Primary research gives you direct access to the subject of your research. I'll just go through the types of sources and we can discuss the criteria. So secondary sources provide secondhand information and commentary from other researchers. Examples can include journal articles, reviews, and academic books. Secondary research describes, interprets, or synthesizes information from primary sources. And tertiary sources provide an overview of information gathered from primary and secondary sources, but does not provide original interpretations or analysis. So examples would include an encyclopedia, another kind of reference book, and articles that would not be used as sources in academic writing. So we have levels of historical supporting evidence. So that would include, so 1 would be no evidence at all. So there's no exemplar or accounts to support the historicity, how do you pronounce that, of the product. No primary, secondary sources or citations at all. A 2 would be one or more pieces of supporting evidence presented to support the historicity of the project with no consideration of the historical content. A partial list of secondary sources, but there's no citations. And citations can be anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be like a parenthetical academic citation. It can be so-and-so said this from whatever book. I think. Yeah. A 3 would be one or more pieces of supporting evidence with limited consideration of the historical context, and a basic list of secondary sources is referenced, but again, no citations of primary sources. 4 is one or more pieces of supporting evidence with significant consideration of historical context, and a full list of secondary sources. So that would be like everything that you can basically think of is referenced, and there's one primary source for a 4, for a 5, and a 6. Very much like the 4, 6 has exhausted consideration of the historical context. So really going over everything that you could possibly think of on that particular topic or piece that they're trying to recreate. A full list of the secondary sources, 2 or more primary citations for a 5, and a 6 would be a full list and multiple citations for both primary and secondary. And the levels of historical support would be limited, 1 or 2 sources or exemplars, significant 3 to 5 sources or exemplars, substantial, most of the sources or exemplars one might expect, and exhaustive, every source and exemplar one might respect, and some complementary or supplementary to further flesh out the details. I think that's everything unless I forgot something.
No, you didn't forget anything. Nope. There are 3 notes though that I want to make that we kind of talked about when we were talking about this presentation. The first is there may be something that you are judging that there really literally is no evidence to explain how something was done or what materials were used or what its use might have been, right? In that case, we are not looking for you to penalize that person if there's literally no evidence out there, but we would expect them, if there is no evidence about a particular aspect of something, to have been able to at least say, but here are the other things that I looked up to try to figure out how to make some well-informed conclusions or suppositions about this thing, or this is why I chose this method, even though there's no evidence about it, because it was used in this, complementary craft as an example. So this is not meant to be an aha or an I gotcha moment or a moment where you can say, well, you picked a really hard topic and so there's no evidence and so therefore I'm going to give you 1 or a 2. If they could demonstrate that they really did do their due diligence to try to find research or supporting evidence, and if there was no supporting evidence that they could find, they then went sort of to the next best step. I want to make sure that they're not being penalized. So Emily says, when you say pleasing, how does that parse with projects that are not pretty projects? That's exactly why we use the term pleasing and not pretty, right? So pleasing means it is something that you feel like you should or could expect if you were to go see it in a museum. Again, we are not asking for reproductions. People can use their creative abilities to decide how to do their own interpretation of an object. But is it something that you would essentially expect to see in period? Does it please you to see? If you saw it in a movie, right, would you be like, oh man, that was a really good attempt at things. That is pleasing. Or like, oh, that's obviously very modern. Not as pleasing. Mistress Gwyneth says, would a score of a 5 or 6 example be an annotated bibliography? No, we don't want people to be worried about how they are doing their citations and their sources, etc. As we mentioned in the beginning of this, we do not want people to have to read a 40 to 100 page documentation on their holiday, on their vacation. But what it does mean is that, oh, good night, I love you. Thank you. Okay, see you later. What it does mean is that when you are talking to the entrant, anything that you would sort of expect them to have accessed at some point, to have read, to have consumed, to have considered in the construction of things. If they can basically check off all those boxes, you're like, okay, they've covered this, they've covered this, they covered this. Wow, they even said they covered this, which I might not have even thought of. I would consider that exhaustive. Emily says, when scoring, should each section result in a whole number score, or does each element within a section get scored? No, you should have only one whole number score. There are no half numbers for this. I know that we do half numbers in the mid-realm. We are not doing half numbers here at Pennsic. And yes, so in the section of methods, for example, you will only have one score. There may be some multiple elements for you to consider when coming up with that score. And one of the complications may be that they might be a 4 on one of those elements, but a 5 on another element, or a 2 and a 6, you know what I'm saying? In that case, then it is up to you to sort of put them where you feel is most accurate and best reflects where you think that particular entry should go. Looking to see if there's any other questions right now on the made objects rubric. I will give everybody a moment because I know that I did ask you to type in your notes. Guillaume, Guillaume, you're okay. You scanned 47 pages and you'll read in greater detail later. Yes, despite our best efforts to tell some of our entrants, they did not have to do super long entry documentation or, supporting evidence. Some of them did, and that's okay too, right? We just tried to encourage people that they did not feel like they had to in order to have a successful entry. We really want this to be more about what the person has created, what they attempted to create, and really the time and research and effort and thought, the critical thought that went into this. So Mendelsohn says, do judges need to agree on a score? No, we do not do consensus judging at Pennsic. You are free to engage your fellow judges in a conversation if you want, and if that's your style of things. Some people prefer, once they're done with the sort of question and answer period, to just go off on their own, write their own comments and do their own scoring. Others may prefer to have conversations with other judges, and so we just ask if you request of them, hey, would you like to have a quick conversation, or what did you think about this, or I'm really kind of torn between a 5 and a 6 on this one, what are your thoughts? You're certainly welcome to have those conversations, but consensus is not required. Any other questions on the made objects rubric? And if you're typing in, you can go ahead and just put a raised hand so I'll know to wait. We'll give it just another minute or two. You're welcome. Tang Whistle says, wondering, what do you do when you know a finished seam is not done in period? Well, I would have a conversation with the entrant. I would ask them why they made that decision. And if you feel like something really wasn't done in period, then I think you would need to take that into consideration with your scoring in that respective category. If people are doing modern things and you know it wasn't period and you feel like that shouldn't have been done, then it is okay to deduct from the score. So I'm going to give just another couple of seconds for any other questions. Of course, in the meantime, if you have any other questions, you're welcome to. During the judging, if you have any questions, both Winnie, myself, Radigan, and Eskar will be around. We'll try to sort of take turns wandering around if there's any questions, and we will introduce ourselves at the beginning in the judges and entrance meetings, so you know who we are and what garb we're wearing that day for easy spotting. And you can also email us at any of the email addresses, but certainly the one that sent out the judging notification. Before we move on, I'm going to kill a little bit of time to give people a last bit of time to type in any other questions. I do want to say, I know that a couple of judges have emailed us back to say either there was some kind of judging conflict, whether schedule or otherwise. We wanted to give a couple of days for all of those various sort of conflicts to sort of fall out. And then probably this weekend, Winnie and I will get together again and say, okay, what are we doing? Who are we subbing in? How are we doing that? Or sometime very soon. So if you were originally scheduled to judge and you have expressed that you have some sort of conflict, we are going to attempt to handle those over the next few days. Give us 4 or 5 days. What do we have next? What is our next rubric that we're going over? Is it
food and beverage?
All right, food and beverage.
Do we have to do the performing arts? Because I don't know if we have any.
No, yeah, we're going to skip performing arts. We do not have any entries at this that I'm aware of at this time.
Same.
So food and beverage is next. We did schedule them first thing in the morning so that the food is not staying out all day long. And hopefully you all can see the food and beverage rubric on the left-hand side. Can everybody see it okay? I'm doing my best to increase the size as much as possible, but the recording will have it better. Okay, so food and beverage rubric. Again, you're going to hear a lot of the same things that you did here in the made objects rubric, especially since the food and beverage rubric did not originally exist. We did adapt it from the made objects, but there are a couple of differences that we do want to go over. In terms of the weak, adequate, and sound justification, those are, again, all pretty much the same. Weak is relying on assumptions without any evidence or pictorial notions or descriptions of things, citing from tertiary sources. Adequate means you've got secondary sources and maybe a couple of primary, and the extrapolations that you're making are at least a debatable argument. You've at least made an attempt. And then sound justification means you've made a very compelling argument. Even if you don't agree with it, at least you feel like it's a very compelling argument. Excuse me. Same thing for the levels of evidence. Some evidence means 2 or 3 pieces of evidence from only one source. Most evidence means many secondary sources and perhaps a few primary sources. Whereas all of the known evidence, again, we're not literally expecting to have like a 37-page bibliography, but it's sort of like all of the sources you would expect them to have cited in this area, and extrapolations are also cited, then that's fine. Again, we do not want massive bibliographies in these as the only way to demonstrate that they have all of the evidence. Winnie, do you want to take over for execution and taste and aroma, or do you want me to keep going?
I can take over.
Awesome. Go ahead.
So for execution, taste, and aroma, where is that? Sorry. Yes. So for the entry scope level elements, single ingredient, which required minimum research. The steps required little time to prepare. The technique is simple. There's no mastery. It's got some obvious flaws. The finish, it's either unfinished, raw, or unfermented, or it's just poorly finished. Appearance, rushed and superficial, and completely modern if known. And the taste and aroma would also be completely modern with no justification, given for variations from historical palettes and or scents. So the elementary scope, elements would be single or few ingredients, which required minimal research. The steps required little to no time to prepare, so less than 3 steps. The technique required more than basic skill, with basic research and practice to prepare, but still pretty, again, elementary. The finish would be neat but would also still have some visible execution flaws and not as finished or detailed as the original. The appearance would be pleasing but modern. And the taste and aroma would still be mostly modern with a weak justification given for the variance. So if it's intermediate, it'll have several ingredients. The steps will be more than 3 steps needed to complete the object, and the entry required preparation time. The technique would require the entrant to learn a new skill or process. And the finish would be neat with few visible execution flaws, but still not as detailed or finished as the original. And the appearance would be pleasing and mostly historical with a few modern execution and details. It'd be partially modern with the adequate justification for the variations. The advanced scope would have several ingredients, multiple stages and or preparation processes for individual ingredients such as parching rice, breeding a starter, pickling, or preserving a filling. The technique would require experimentation in order to understand and develop historic methods or processes. The finish would be neat with some detail and finish like the original and invisible execution flaws. The appearance would be pleasing and mostly historical with a mix of modern and historical execution and details, and with adequate justification for most variations from the historic palettes and scents. The complex scope, it would have several ingredients again, and it would have multiple stages or preparation processes for individual ingredients. So same as before. The technique would require extensive experimentation or research to inform the product. For example, the recipe would be translated from a foreign language and would be up to interpretation and extrapolation in order to understand and develop the historic methods and processes. The finish, again, would be neat with some detail and finish like the original and invisible execution flaws. And the appearance would be pleasing and mostly historical, with a mix of modern and historical execution and details, if known. And the taste and aroma would be entirely period with sound justification given for most variations. If the project is sophisticated, it would again have several ingredients, multiple stages or preparation processes for individual ingredients, including growing, harvesting, processing, and or making some of the individual ingredients prior to preparation. For example, grinding wheat for flour, milking your own cow or goat, or acquiring other animal milk from the animal. Those are just some examples. Technique. The technique would require extensive experimentation or research to inform the project. Again, translating a recipe for a foreign language, having to interpret or extrapolate from the recipe in order to understand and develop the historic methods and processes. The finish would be neat with some detail and finish like the original, invisible execution flaws, and the appearance would be pleasing and mostly historical, with a mix of modern and historical execution and details, and there would be very sound justification for all variations from historic palettes and or scents.
Okay, so we're gonna stop right there and see if there are any questions about the food and beverage rubric itself. We haven't covered materials or methods, says somebody. Okay, so let me go up really quickly. I think the reason for that, the methods, those things are very much the same in terms of it's partly modern or partly historical. The weak versus some versus most or all variations or justifications is very much the same as described under made object. And that's where we talked about some versus most of the evidence. Then for materials, this was pretty straightforward. You either gave no justification, weak, adequate, or sound, which again, we've already explained what we mean by those things. And then the same thing for modern versus partly modern and partly historical, or mostly modern and partly historical, or mostly historical and partly modern. It's all kind of straightforward, which is why we skipped over those two things. So are there any questions about the food and beverage rubric? I apologize about the sort of discombobulated way in which that came out. I got my notes all mixed up. The one note I want to make here on food, very much like pleasing versus pretty, we also were intentional about not saying that the food had to taste good. Now, that is not to encourage bad tasting food, but we also recognize that our modern palates aren't always attuned to what might have been in period. And so we wanted those that would be entering in this category to be able to do something that would have been period accurate and would have perhaps imitated a period palate or period taste that was supposed to be achieved. So we don't want people to necessarily be penalized if that didn't obviously meet your taste, and that I think the food judges and beverage judges know better than that. It shouldn't always just be about what you personally like, but more, is that what I would have expected of a particular cut of meat, for example, or a particular presentation of a root-based vegetable dish, right? Again, I may not love root-based vegetables. It may not be good to me, but at least what they're explaining to me in the ingredients, it seems like there's probably a good balance of ingredients, and it probably approximates what a period taste of that particular dish may have tasted like. So I'm not seeing any questions. Kay says, yes, the food needs to taste like what it is made of. And the sweet and sour fish of blessed memory is still a great example. It worked as a dish. I feel like I need to hear that story later, Kay. So we have just about 5 or 10 minutes left. I'm going to go ahead and zip on to the next one, which is the research rubric. I want to make a quick note here that this is the first time, I think, in history, I'd be curious to hear some perspectives on that we are including not just research papers, but research projects as well. We wanted to encourage historical, our experiential archaeological projects. But the key for both a research paper and a research project cannot just be like, look at this really cool thing I did, and ta-da! And that makes it very hard for you to judge. Instead, both a research paper and a research project need to be attempting to either explore or prove something did or did not exist, or was or was not used, as an example. I'm hearing more of the fishy stories. So, okay. So I'm going to pull up really quickly the research rubric. There's not a lot to go over that is going to be super different than the other two, which is why we covered the first two first. But I do want to briefly go over it, and I'm going to go full screen here. So in terms of the scopes, here we are going to be talking about scope and historicity. And I'll expand this a little bit here. So in terms of a research paper or a research project, an entry-level scope paper or project is one that basically covers a broad subject of which there is a flood of information that is readily available, and the subject basically does not really display that much ambition. Elementary is a common subject for which there is substantial information readily available. And again, the subject's really not displaying a lot of ambition, whereas an intermediate scope is where you start to see that a subject has sort of been narrowed down from a majorly broad area to a more focused one, where there may still be some information that's pretty readily available, but it does in fact show that the entrant had to put a little bit of legwork in there, and it's showing some ambition. An advanced scope research project or paper is one that there is certainly information that is available with some legwork perhaps, and that the subject itself displays a decent level of ambition. Complex is a specific subject for which there may be little information available, and maybe that information is with a lot of legwork. They also brought in complementary and supplementary related information to draw in order to provide some additional considerations sort of for critical thought. And the subject displays a high level of ambition and contributes to our knowledge base as a society. And finally, a sophisticated scope in a research paper or project is a niche subject which may have very little information available with a lot of legwork. There's also complementary and supplementary related information drawn in to provide additional considerations. And they may have performed some sort of original research or translation. The subject is extremely ambitious, and it significantly contributes to our knowledge base. In terms of sort of the level of historical context, which is this middle section of consideration, we use terms like minimal, inconsistent, sufficient, ample, thorough, and exhaustive. And to give some sort of distinctions between them, minimal is basically that there's only a passing mention or no mention at all of its historical context. Inconsistent means that it may occasionally tie back to the context, where maybe the context is still a little questionable. Sufficient is enough information from at least one perspective is given to tie it into the context for some people. Ample is that the context is tied in with a significant quantity of references from at least one perspective. And thorough is the context is tied in with references from multiple perspectives, while exhaustive is that the context is completely established from multiple perspectives with proactive considerations for arguments against this context. Now, I am going to say, as somebody who considers themselves a research laurel, the word exhaustive here is maybe not the right word to use, because in my opinion, research is never exhausted. However, we're going to harken back to what we were saying earlier in terms of the main objects, and it's really, are they touching bases and looking at every avenue that you could possibly think of, suggest, and expect? If you say, yes, there may not have been any information about the method of doing this particular woodworking project, but did you talk to a woodworker who said, if you were to approach this, how would you approach it, for example? So that is an example of, you are at least attempting to sort of knock on every door while trying to solve the riddle or prove or disprove something within your research project or paper. Now, the third section is on the supporting evidence. And so that's pretty straightforward. Did they use no, minimal, coherent, strong, or compelling supporting evidence that the project is pre-17th century? I am going to imagine that almost every project is going to be in the strong and compelling area. I would be shocked to see any projects that were not, so we're really not going to cover that too much. Then we'll go on to the next section, which is source utilization. Primary, secondary, and tertiary sources, again, very similar to what we talked about before, so we're not going to go over those again. And then the second section here talks about supporting evidence quality. And so we see things like inconsistent, adequate, reliable. Hang on a second, that might be the next. Here we go, it's up here, sorry. Inconsistent, adequate, reliable, strong, and compelling. We described these earlier when talking about the food and beverage. Inconsistent means it's occasional or haphazard. Adequate is like, you get it from at least one perspective. Reliable is multiple perspectives. Strong is that it's not only multiple perspectives, but that you are supporting conclusions in a fashion that would be hard to argue against, versus compelling being like, it's really almost impossible to argue against it. They really covered it from all angles. In terms of investigation, this category down here, we talk about levels of original investigative angle, analysis, research, and experimentation. So either they did none at all, only one attempt, some is more than one attempt, significant is several attempts, thorough is many attempts, and exhaustive is they gave it every reasonable shot or attempt to try to look at something from a different angle and prove or disprove from every possible argument that could be made for or against, or everything that one might have expected or considered at that time. I'll pause here to take questions. Guillaume, again, you ask about extensive. Yeah, so extensive and exhaustive, again, did they cover everything that you reasonably felt they could expect? We are not looking for an I gotcha moment, as I mentioned earlier. If you know of one article that is super obscure that perhaps they didn't know, I'm not necessarily asking for you to deduct that point. But if there is new evidence or new research in a field that somebody who is well versed in that field should be reasonably expected to know about, then in that case, we would say, well, maybe then it is appropriate to dock them a point. Now, is it appropriate to dock one whole point for one missing article, journal, book, etc.? Maybe. That will be up to you as the judge to decide whether or not it's such a crucial piece of evidence that should have been considered, or if it only would have sort of helped a little bit, and it's great to sort of drop that information to them in the conversation, but not necessarily something you need to deduct against. Next category is critical analysis. Winnie, I will offer it to you if you want to try and unmute. And I know that this is kind of where
sorry about that.
That's okay. I just want to make sure I'm giving you the opportunity to go over some of these too.
Yep, I got it. Sorry, husband also brought me dinner, so.
Hi, hubby.
All right. So we're at critical analysis?
Yes.
Or investigation?
Critical analysis.
Cool. So critical analysis. So sparse would be supporting evidence is only occasionally presented when expected. And the argument would be completely unconvincing. Rare, so number 2, would be supporting evidence and original investigation is only occasionally presented when expected, and the argument would be fairly weak. Sufficient would be supporting evidence and original investigation is enough to back conclusions. The argument is well reserved, however, no counter arguments are considered. Sufficient would be supporting evidence. I just read that. Sorry. Ample would be enough supporting evidence and original investigation is presented. Sorry, that's number 4. So the argument would also be coherent and with conjectures mostly supported and counter arguments addressed with adequate responses. Thorough. I don't have anything written down, but I'm going to say this.
Yeah, I think that's where we petered off.
Evidence. Yeah, it's plenty of supporting evidence and original investigation is presented. And the argument is strong with conjecture fully supported and counter arguments addressed with sound responses. And exhaustive, again, we've talked about exhausted. So every reasonable attempt, as much as supporting evidence as you can think of without being too obscure. Although if obscure stuff is there, that's great. And the argument is compelling with conjectures completely supported and counter arguments addressed with very strong responses.
And then this last section is on dissemination. And I just want to we're not going to go over this too much, but we want to make sure that this is not about grammar and punctuation and citations, right? This is more about how effectively did that entrant communicate their thoughts, their ideas, research, maybe original or otherwise, that they have found. How well did they communicate that and their point or their thesis or their theory to you, whether that is done in a paper format or it is done in a sort of a display format so that you can see the entirety of the research project. That could possibly be the display, could be photographs that are put together. It could also just simply be their presentation to you. Here's what I was attempting to find out. Here's what I did, here's what I found, and so therefore I have come to X conclusion. So ultimately, dissemination is not about, like I said, how beautiful was your display and how many periods do you make sure were accurately in the places they were supposed to be. It's about how well they're communicating themselves to you. And it should be done in a combination, as appropriate for the entry, of text, images, data or research experiments results, and if appropriate, their display and verbal presentation. So I'm going to stop this right here and ask if there are any questions about research projects. I recognize that we are just a little over on time, and I apologize and appreciate those of you that are still there. So any other questions about research projects, papers, or any of the three rubrics? We'll give you guys a few minutes to type in those answers or questions. And if you have the answer, I'd love to hear it. As I mentioned at the beginning of this, while you guys are typing in any questions you may still have, we are going to attempt to put this up before the next training. That's my personal goal. We'll see if that happens, but certainly very, very soon, so that if you want to rewatch, or if you know of another judge that missed it and will not be able to make the other trainings, they can certainly watch it on their own. And we, of course, just assume that if you tell us in good faith that you watched the presentation, that's good enough for us. We just want to make sure that we're all on the same page, because we recognize that there's different interpretations of things, and there's different cultural ways that different kingdoms, not just the East and the Mid Realm, but we have a number of judges from other kingdoms do things. And so we just kind of want to hopefully put everybody on the same page. It's been a long 4 years. Will research entries be supported with displays, or does it vary? It will vary. I will probably not expect, for example, a research paper to have much of a display, but if it's a research project, you will probably find that it is going to have some sort of display. And if there are any other questions, please feel free to contact Winnie or myself. You should be able to find our information. If you can't look up for the war rules, it's there. And I appreciate everybody's time. I apologize about going just a little over with a couple of the technical glitches we had, but we appreciate your patience, and we appreciate your service and participation if you're an entrant. So thank you very much. Bye.